All right, everybody. So on today's show, there's been a lot of people focused on trying to do some power plant improvements on their Volkswagens. And one of the alternative methods that people have been reaching out to for a long time over the past few years has been the Subaru platform. And in order to bring you guys the people that know the most on that, and bringing, in what my opinion is one of the foremost experts in Subaru conversions and aftermarket Subaru parts, is John Rykowski from Outfront Motorsports. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So, John, the way we always start the podcast is, what's your VW story and how did you get into Volkswagens?
Well, my VW story would start probably in about 1976. I was 14 years old. I was always involved in mechanics, and my brother-in-law had a VW Bug, and I rebuilt his motor when I was 14 years old. When I did it, I made like $100 or $200, and I thought, wow, for a young teenager, this was a great way to make some money. And of course, I smashed main bearing journals with pins and things, crazy things like that. I mean, as a 14-year-old, how much could you know? But anyways, that was my introduction a little bit into automotive, at least in a business sense, with my brother-in-law. And it took off from there. I had always had an auto repair shop out of my mom's garage at home, and I worked on all types of cars, but VWs were kind of interesting. They were definitely unique to work on. So anyways, I rebuilt my first VW, and then did some through the years. I started an auto repair shop in 1980, about 1983. And at that point, I was working on cars, full shop. And then my friend got me into going to the sand dunes. And of course, for me to go to the sand dunes, I had to have a dune buggy. So I bought a $1,500 dune buggy, had an 1835 in it. And of course, that was a really small motor, not very much power. And it blew up, of course. And so I decided to start doing something bigger. I got into ARP split case. It was a 3-piece case with a drop camshaft, and I had a 90mm stroke and 101.4 4-inch bore. It was Siamese cylinders, superflow angle port heads, fuel injection. It was a 2919cc VW motor that I put in my dune buggy. That was I thought I'd be the fastest guy in the world. Incredible 1/2-inch head studs, that kind of thing, and I put it all together. And I mean, it was great. It was good. But it still was a VW. I still had problems, had to adjust the valves every single trip. Oil leaks were impossible. Of course, I didn't have any carb jets to plug up because I was fuel injection, but it was only okay, And anyways, one day I was out there, I parked my car in the sand dunes, shut it off, and went to start it, and the motor locked up. And lo and behold, one of my exhaust seats fell out, held my exhaust valve open, and locked my motor up. And that was it. I had so much money in that motor. I probably had, $10,000 of parts, wedge-mated crankshaft, and all this kind of crazy stuff. And I said, I'm done. I'm done with this motor. I sold the parts for $4,000. And my buddy told me, hey, why don't you put a Subaru motor in your car? That's what everybody else is doing. So why don't you try putting a Subaru in? So I went down, bought a $600 Subaru at the time, a 2-liter. And bought a computer, and I bought a special turbo from Japan that was only available in Japan because it was some hot rod turbo, what didn't exist in California, in the United States. So I put that together and went out, and unbelievable. That thing had so much power. I ran it 20 pounds of boost on race gas, and it was estimated probably 350 horsepower. By the way, my 2919cc only had about 200 horsepower. That was it.
Wow.
And yeah, so I put this thing together. I mean, I had, maybe $3,000 altogether and a lot of my time. And here I was with 350 horsepower in my car. It was just a rocket ship. And I said, man, why would anybody ever build a VW when this kind of power was there, especially after having come from that $10,000, $12,000 motor I had? So that was the beginning of Outfront Motorsports. Actually, back then it was called Outback Motorsports. We just came up with the name, my friend and I, because for 2 reasons. One, it was a Subaru, and so that we kind of called it the Outback because Australia. And we did the work on these motors out back of my auto repair shop. So we called it Outback Motorsports. But there's a little funny story about that. A few years later, after we got kind of established, I never did a trademark on my name, and Subaru came after me and gave me a cease and desist on using the name Outback, because it had, Subaru had a car called the Outback in 1997 or 98, and so I couldn't use the name. They told me, I'm going to get sued big time if I don't drop the name, so I stopped selling all the parts, changed my name to Outfront Motorsports. So that's what happened. And
so one of the questions that I have is, you go right from, like, I'm assuming you're like a sand addicted guy. Like, as soon as you get in, you go right from 1835 to 2900 cc, like full blown race motor.
Yeah. So, well, I went to the sand dunes first. Was introduced to the sand dunes with a motorcycle, and I had no idea how much taxing the sand is on motors. I mean, the sand is really heavy. I had a Yamaha IT200. It was a little two-stroke dual sport bike back in the day. I don't know. I think it was like 1986. Anyways, I thought that thing was awesome. I went to the sand and I seized it in about 2 hours. And then then my buddies I go to the big hill and everyone's racing CR500s. And so I didn't have that kind of money back then. So I had a CR480. Anyone knows a CR480? It's an air-cooled, just a beast, and just vibrated my hands. I mean, it had big power, but it just vibrated my hands. I used that for like 2 or 3 trips. I couldn't handle it anymore. I bought a water-cooled CR500, and then I started building that motor. I put it on methanol, bored and stroked, just crazy stuff, massive ports, extended swing arm. And so I was really into racing, drag racing in the sand dunes with my motorcycle. And then, I started getting involved with the sand, and a lot of my other friends had dune buggies. And so that's what the crave, when I went to the dune buggy, bought that $1,500 dune buggy. And so I still rode a motorcycle for a while, but I did have that VW 1835, and I did go straight to that 2919 because I was a mechanic. It was easy for me to do, and I just wanted to go all out, thinking, this would be my last motor I ever built, and clearly it wasn't even close.
Now, when you're doing when you're working on the Subi swap at that time, like, it's not a super popular thing, or it's just starting to gain some traction in the dunes, or what? Everybody. I mean, you go right to the pinnacle, the 3-piece case, the fuel injection. I'm assuming it was like a Phyta or a Hellbrand fuel injection, or
it was the electronic fuel injection. I don't remember the brand, but I had 50 millimeter throttle bodies, twin. You still have linkage to deal with and stuff like that, and it was just fuel injection back then. That was in the late 90s, like 1995, 1998, that kind of range. And there just wasn't a lot of stuff going on with fuel injection. It was so I don't remember what the brand it was.
Well, so when you're doing that, I mean, you're now out there and working on this, and you're seeing this Subaru, right? Like the super small compact setup with overhead cam at that time. I'm assuming your first conversion was a single cam motor. I mean, it's like a whole foreign world, because now you got water cooled, you've got a lot of different variables. Was there a bunch of aftermarket stuff available at the time, or not really?
Sure. Well, a couple things. One, there was another company out there. It was called Leading Edge. That was the company that was probably foremost, made a big impact in the sand dunes, and they were selling motors for really big money. That company no longer exists. They went out of business. They didn't have very good business practices. But anyways, they had a gorgeous 1-page color ad in the Sand Sports magazine, and they're selling these motors for $15,000, $20,000, just really expensive. Calling them 400, 500 horsepower motors, and so that's where I got my idea. I should be putting a Subaru in there. So back when I did this is again late 90s. I bought a 2-liter turbo. All the 2-liter turbos were 4-cam engines, so it was a quad cam engine, dual overhead cam, if you will, and it was a little 2-liter factory turbo motor. So it was designed to have really strong pistons, had piston oil squirters out of the crankshaft main journals. It was a pretty stout motor. And I took that $600 stock motor, never even took the valve covers off, really didn't even clean it up. I just bought an adapter kit, put that motor in there, put the fuel injection on, and stuck that turbo on. It was just amazing. It was really crude. It was very ugly looking, but for me, it was all about power and speed. It had nothing to do with looks. Obviously, looks came later down the road.
So with that, fuel injection setup, what is the first the first EFI setup you do? Do you convert a factory computer, or was everything, did they have aftermarket computers back then?
Yeah, so factory computers were really not doable, because unless you just built a totally stock motor. Now remember, a stock ECU, the goal is to have best emissions. So that's not necessarily best power. Best power is found at a different air-fuel ratio than best emissions. And so there was no real purpose of wanting to try to even do a factory ECU. If I was buying these motors, they were hard to get an ECU with them. So I just went to a company that sold a aftermarket ECU. It was back in the day, it was like I don't know, $500 or $600 for the computer. It had an open-ended wire harness, and then I had to terminate the wire harness on the engine. And then I started. It had a little handheld tuning module that you would use, and so I just set up some parameters, and I used my butt dyno. That's just going back and forth in the sand, back and forth till it sounded and ran better and better. I didn't have a dyno at the time, and so there's no way for me to dyno it. Didn't have the money to pay for a dyno or for a dyno tune. So I just did it myself. And again, it was still just flat out amazing. By the time I was done after a couple of days, it was incredible.
And back when you're doing that, I mean, you come into this market, there's not a lot of stuff available. You've got one big guy in the market, and then you start to really get into this. And I'm assuming a bunch of your buddies that are into the sand stuff are like, hey, John's doing this. I'm going to have him do a conversion for me. I'm going to have him get rid of my VW motor and start going down that direction. At what point, I mean, what are some of the initial hurdles that you have to start getting over in respect to the early conversions you guys were doing, some of the problems that you solved with some of the products you came up with?
Sure. So one of the problems I had was manpower. So I had a bona fide operating auto repair shop, and then I'm starting to do Outback Motorsports out back, and I had a partner involved with me, and we were doing this kind of after hours, but it was kind of eating into my normal car repair time. So I'm only one guy. I could only do either working on street cars or I'm working on my dune buggy project. So I kind of that was one of my biggest hurdles there. So I had a partner that helped me do some fab work, and I was taking phone calls. And again, my motors weren't very pretty, but they were functional. So I was kind of on the low end when I started this business. I just started putting things together and made them work, and made them stay together. Then later, a couple years later, we officially started Outback Motorsports in the year 2000 with my partner. And basically that lasted for about a year. I paid off my partner, and then I basically went on my own, did Outback Motorsports.
And now what are some of the first things that you start to bring to the market that you see a huge need for? I mean, I saw, you do a lot of pieces and parts that bolt on from take off the factory stuff, and you make some more functional pieces, like what? You do some of the oil fills and some of the bracketry and whatnot. What are all the accessories on the outside that you guys do?
Well, before we get to that, what happened was,
Sure.
it was so successful. Then I started making my motors look pretty. So now came the chrome and the polish, and maybe made some custom little billet parts. But the real thing that made us take off was it was a good looking motor, had great power. And so I was selling complete turnkey engines at this point. Mainly you had an adapter kit, and you had a shortened oil pan, and you had a custom header. And I was selling parts really. I mean, there was a time every Thursday night we would work till like midnight, and people would come to my shop after hours, after 6 o'clock, when I was done with my street cars. And so here comes 7 o'clock all the way till 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. People would just be coming in, buying parts. They would go buy their own motor, and they would buy, the computer and wire harness from me, or the adapter kit, or the shortened oil pan. And so we kind of did it a la carte at the beginning. And then I started moving up in the clientele base, where now I was dealing with clients that wanted to have a whole turnkey engine. They didn't want to do it themselves. And so just a natural progression of me starting to turn motors into turnkey engines.
And at that point, when you're doing the motors and and you're going to turnkey stuff, you're in this market. You know, the VW market's always been like super resourceful individuals, right? Like guys that are do it yourselfer kind of people, and they have a tendency to be a little bit, let's say, on the cheap side, right? So I think maybe you're already plugged into the market, because sometimes people get into a market like this and they want to do everything. They don't want to just sell you a part or a piece. They want to sell you the whole thing complete. And is it the experience that you have with a lot of resourceful sand people that you end up supplying a part or a piece, or they'll get their own motors and all this kind of stuff? And I want to get into the motor variations that they have in a second, but how much stuff when these guys are first doing their conversions, like, is there a specific motor they're looking for? I mean, because your website's super helpful. And so were you right out of the gate just giving lots of advice as to like, hey, I'll just sell you half the parts or the injection pieces and whatnot, and helping people get things like that on the ground?
Sure. So for my dune buggy side, really people want turnkey engines, but we're totally open to a la carte type of purchasing, where someone might want to do this project all themselves, like you mentioned. So not opposed to someone buying a motor themselves and putting it together. I won't take their motor and make a turnkey engine, because then I'm setting myself up for using a used motor that could blow up, 3 weeks down the road. And then the guy's going to say, well, whose fault was it? Did you do it? So, I don't deal with used motors anymore. If someone wants to do be on the cheap side and buy their own used motor, I will sell them all the parts to make this happen. So that might be alternator brackets and shortened oil pans and adapter kits and computer and wire harness. So yeah, and what I really do, first time a person calls me asking about some things, I really kind of clear the air and tell them, look, this is kind of how much it's going to be costing before we even get started, because a lot of guys have perceptions of, oh, well, I can go buy a motor for $1,000, and for a couple $100 more, I'm going to have a Subaru motor running in the VW, and that's really far from the truth. Right. I let them know that if you bought a motor, you might be buying $3,500 more of parts from me in order to make that motor work. That's really easy to. I mean, I could talk to you about a computer and wire harness at $1,700, and a shortened oil pan at $270, and a header, let's see, a fuel pump, and the adapter kit is $480. I mean, right there, I just rattled off $3,000 worth of parts plus your motor. So, and plus all your time. So people have to realize that it's never going to be a $2,000 or $3,000 ordeal. They have to prepare themselves. If I sell a 2.5 non-turbo turnkey package for $7,000, and of course that's rebuilt also, so the whole motor is rebuilt. Clearly, you could make that package happen probably in the $3,000 to $4,000 area. It depends on how resourceful you are and how much time you put in there. But you're going to have a used motor at $3,000 or $4,000, and it won't look pretty easy. There won't be any cosmetic parts. My $7,000 motor package is rebuilt, chrome and polish, all done. The motor runs. You can hear it run on a test stand before you even pick it up. So, and then once you kind of realize that, hey, the motor might cost me $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, maybe even $7,000, you have to realize that that's no radiator, that's not installed, that's just the motor sitting there. So, installing the motor, making water lines, putting a radiator in, that could very easily be a couple $1,000 more to install into a bug.
Yeah, and some of the things, there's a Subaru swap site on Facebook, and it's a group that they're VW people that are putting Subarus, and so a lot of the guys are DIY guys, and so for people that are like in the do-it-yourselfer stuff, I mean, all the parts and pieces they can get directly from you, I'm assuming, in order to do that conversion. What I wanted to talk about was the main differences with a Subaru long block versus a VW long block. Obviously, one's water cooled, but does the Subaru motor come with like a factory counterweighted crank? Obviously, the oiling system. I mean, head and shoulders, the design is we're talking it's 30 years advanced, same engine technology.
Yeah, the Subaru is far superior than any Volkswagen motor. They have 5 main bearing journals, where a VW bug, it has only 3 main journals. The case is made out of aluminum, not magnesium. It's water cooled, 16 valve technology. So all Subaru motors have 16 valves. I should say all EJ motors from 1990 on, Subaru had a drastic platform change. So things before 1990, no one uses anything that old. They went from an EA motor, twin timing belts. I mean, it was an old school Subaru water cooled. It was kind of their old motor. And in 1990, they made a drastic change, and that's when the EJ series came out. And so the EJ series covers 1.8, 2.0, 2.2, and 2.5. So all those four motors are basically based off the same block, the same oil pump, same oil pan, same adapter kit and flywheel. The blocks are almost effectively interchangeable. They're the same size. And so things became very consolidated.
And now, so those are the primary motors that you guys do, are the EJ platform. That's the most universal, easily adaptable, and everything that you build is around that platform.
Yeah, nothing's older than, we never do anything older than 1990 because that would be, it wouldn't be an EJ platform. Correct.
Yeah. And so on the EJ platform, now we're talking like for a conversion for a Volkswagen. We talked a little bit previously to the podcast, and a lot of these guys, like some of the biggest challenges when people come to you with Volkswagen conversions, obviously everybody walks in. It's like this. It's the same Volkswagen guy that we've always been dealing with, right? He wants 300 horsepower, daily drivable reliability, and the same thing they wanted with air cooled. Now they go, well, it's a Subaru, so it should be able to handle that. But what's the reality? I mean,
perfect question. So my opinion would be that you want to target 200 horsepower. Remember, a stock VW is making 70 horsepower. So to go 200, you're 3 times the horsepower, and you're just going to make your life a lot easier. The problem is a lot of guys shoot for the moon. They want to do a turbo. The turbo adds so much extra complexity to the situation. There's no good place to put the turbo. You got to cut your firewall out. And then I've seen guys make, wooden boxes behind their back seat. They put the radiator in this wooden box. They have, hot air coming into the cab. I mean, I've just seen so many different conversions of people, cutting fenders because they want to use a 2-liter turbo, which is a 4-cam engine. I mean, just all these everyone has these different ideas of what they want to do because they don't know anything about Subarus. The bottom line, single overhead cam, either a 2.2 if you're emissions, or if you're not emissions, you should be looking at a 2.5 single overhead cam. And the years I like is that the years would be 2000 to 2003, in that range. That gives you a low profile intake manifold. You can make 200 horsepower. It's not a drive-by wire throttle body. It's a drive-by cable. And that would be the best platform for someone to do and make 200 horsepower.
And when they're looking to do something like that, there's been a lot of guys that I have a squareback that I want to do a conversion on, and a lot of guys are taking the intake manifold and like they're cutting it and then reversing it and welding it back up together. What's been your experience with messing with the factory air intake manifold and the throttle body and all that kind of stuff? I mean, what's for the most success? Is it try to leave it as factory as possible, or do you have a better alternative?
Yeah, there's no reason to ever cut an intake manifold. We have first of all, the EJ series, all the intake manifolds are reversible, so you can just take them off and turn them around 180 degrees. Mm-hmm. But when you do that, the throttle body is running into the alternator, so you got to relocate the alternator. We make a custom reverse alternator bracket that allows the throttle body to be turned around, or the intake to be turned around and have the throttle body come out the back of the car. So that's the easiest way. And then the other option is to leave is to remote mount the throttle body. People get in this groove where they think the throttle body has to be bolted to the intake. You can simply take the throttle body off, make a tube, a U-bend, a 180, a scorpion tail, whatever you want to do that relocates the throttle body to allow your motor package to fit in there, maybe without cutting the firewall. People put a motor in there, throttle body is touching their firewall, and they're oh man, I got to start cutting. No, just take the throttle body off. We have flanges that you can buy that bolt right onto the intake manifold, and you can just remote mount it with a 2.5-inch U-bend or a 90 or something like that.
And so that, I mean, the manifold, everybody's in their head maybe thinking it's like a carburetor. It's got to be sitting in a certain position or a certain angle. I mean, does it really matter what angle it's, I mean, as long as your linkage is working properly, it doesn't really matter if it's facing left, right, up, down, or whatever. It's just basically monitoring, it's just controlling air intake, right?
Correct. So because the injectors inject right at the cylinder heads, only air is going through the throttle body. So it literally could be upside down, backwards, a 180. Air finds its way around anything. It could be sharp corners. I mean, that's not ideal, but ideally, you know, air can go any which way you want. So maybe you might not have the typical throttle cable that comes up that metal tube on a Type 1, right, but you might want to hook into like a sheathing and have the cable come up and around and maybe go sideways. It might go, you know, throttle body might be mounted sideways in the car, and with a little bit of sheathing and a little longer throttle cable, you could make anything work.
So now if people need to have their Volkswagen, let's say it like here in Las Vegas, we can't have anything 68 and later has to be smogged. So if someone's got to have something that smogs, I would think a bone stock Subaru without any EFI, without any smog stuff on it would outperform from a smog standpoint a Type 1. But there's been this thing where some people use, I've seen a couple companies out there that they just modify a factory computer. What are the pros and cons to that? And I mean, is this a ton of labor for no reason, or what's your take on that?
So we don't do anything with stock ECUs. There's quite a few companies out there that do that. They're more the Vanagon kind of guys who, you know, there's lots of guys that do Subaru and Vanagons, and they're really into doing the stock ECU. So one is that stock ECU conversion. I don't know what the cost is, but I've heard it might be $800 to $1,200, somewhere in that range, where they make a custom wire harness for you. Well, my aftermarket ECU is $1,700, but there's no way the aftermarket ECU is going to be clean enough for factory emissions. So if you have to be smog, you have to work with the stock ECU. The other benefit with the stock ECU is you have really easy starting when it's cold, because it can control the idle speed control motor. Maybe you might get a little bit better gas mileage. Again, you're sacrificing performance for gas mileage. And then the other thing, the negative about that is the factory ECU requires a mass airflow sensor. So you have to deal with this mass airflow sensor between your air filter and your intake manifold, or your air filter and your throttle body. And that's pretty cumbersome. With my ECU, you're just using a MAP sensor, so a small hose goes in the intake manifold, and it could be as simple as the air filter goes right on the throttle body. So that makes things really clean. But again, that doesn't work for a person who has to have emissions.
So some of the main things that people need for the conversions into a sedan or a Type 3 is the flywheel package, the flywheel and bell housing package, the shortened oil pan that you guys make, like we talked about, the manifolds reversible, and then an EFI or fuel management. Have you seen, a lot of people have been doing like the what's the super inexpensive EFI controller, a mega squirt. Now, how does a mega squirt compare to like something that you do or that you sell to someone for as far as fuel management?
So I might be negative here, but I'm just going to tell you what my opinion is. Mega squirt and these homemade ECUs or inexpensive ECUs, I've replaced quite a few of them. If you're real bottom of the barrel scraping, you're really on a budget, maybe you want to go that way. But our wire harness, well, let me talk to that. I don't ever tune a mega squirt in my shop. I don't even know how, meaning I don't have the software. I don't care to do that because that's kind of a do-it-yourself thing. I'm not going to spend my time. I've wasted my time with mega squirts before, have misfires and real bad high RPM operation, things like that. And so it's like, why am I trying to tune an inferior ECU and computer? And it's on a budget deal, and usually the customer that's coming to me is on a major budget. So the mega squirt kind of computer, that's for a guy who wants to do it themselves, and he's okay with doing 4,000 RPM and cruising down the road. But that's just not going to work. I've taken too many of those off to want to even deal with that kind of ECU.
Sure. And so, and touching on that, like on the do-it-yourselfer kind of guy, we talked about what motors he should look for. Is there any telltale things? Like, let's say you're looking at a motor, a guy says, "Hey, I had this motor for my conversion. It's got X amount of miles on it." And, you know, is there any telltale things like with a VW, you grab end play and you check the end play, and if it's all wobbled out, if you can see the end play, it's like, don't even bother because the thing needs a whole rebuild. What's been your experience in regards to, how bulletproof are these things from the factory on the bottom end, and what do they typically require when you're starting with a rebuild, or do you rebuild the whole thing when you rebuild it from the inside out completely?
Yeah, so first of all, the year 2000 to 2003, like the single overhead cam 2.5 that I like, that's a phase two motor. A phase two motor had some upgrades where the thrust bearing was larger. The bottom end really are bulletproof. Can they have problems? Sure, but there's not any external signs that you're going to really see on a Subaru. The best thing I would say is take off the oil cap and look how dirty the oil cap looks on the inside. That's usually an indication on how often the oil is changed. If you have the oil pan off, first thing I would do is pull the oil pan off before you do anything. Make sure if there's no debris or not there's heavy sludge. You know, if there's metallic down there, I mean, hey, the motor's bad, it's going to go bad. Right. If it's no metallic down there and it's not really a lot of sludge or something in there, then I would call that a winner. There are some claims out there on the internet where the single overhead cam 2.5 motor has issues with head gaskets. I don't buy that as often as people claim. I mean, they say that all the time, but even if the head gaskets were bad, you can upgrade them to the STI head gasket, which is a far superior head gasket. It's a pretty easy job. So maybe you might see some external water leaking out of the head gasket area. Okay, so you need head gaskets. But in my case, all my turnkey engines are rebuilt, so all that gets addressed anyways.
And how, like the heads with the Volkswagens, like you said, even on your 2.9 liter, you drop valve seats, stuff like that. On these motors, the head design on these, I mean, are they pretty bulletproof, or do you go through and redo the heads completely, or I mean, does it just depend on the condition of the heads when you get them?
Well, both. The heads are really bulletproof. I mean, you could wipe out a cam journal with really bad oil and you get some scarring. There's no cam bearings in there. The cams ride directly in the head. So, you know, there's possibility you could have some cam issues going on there, but that's pretty rare. The heads, what we do is a valve job is $550 for a pair of heads. So if you send me your heads, we do the complete valve job, valve adjustment, cleaning. We pull out every galley plug. There's lots of galley plugs in cylinder heads. We pipe clean all the galleys out, and we send them back to you all ready to bolt on.
And so I know that when I want to say, when I got a motor from you, what's a rebuilt long block? Like someone wants to come to you and say, "Hey, John, I'm looking for a rebuilt long block from you. What's it going to cost me for a rebuilt long block that's, you know, that's something I can start my conversion with, and I'm kind of on a budget, let's say." What are they looking to spend?
Well, that's where they're going to realize that real fast that maybe buying a turnkey from me is the better way to go. Because if you brought me a motor that had no exhaust and no intake on it, so it had valve covers and had an oil pan on it, that's how I would get it from you in the most stripped down shape. Mm-hmm. And if you handed me that motor, the average price I would tell you is somewhere in the $300 to $3,500 range to rebuild that motor. That's doing bearings, piston rings, doing a valve job, head gaskets, and reassembling the motor. That would be a typical price. So understanding that it costs $300 or $3,500, and you bring me the motor, which costs you $500 or $1,000, you're already $4,000 into the equation. And now you know that I'm going to sell you $3,000 worth of parts, the computer and the adapter kit and the oil pan. So by the time you're done, if you bought a used motor, you had me rebuild it, and then you want to make a turnkey engine, might as well just let me sell you a turnkey engine.
So lastly, camshafts. Do you do much in respects to camshafts, or it's not really needed? I mean, what's the power band on these motors, power band and redline? Like where are we at without that on the Subarus, with the single cams?
Sure. So when we do our tuning with our aftermarket ECU, our rev limiter is set at 7,000 RPM. And by the time they're finally done with all their headaches, they still have to buy a $1,700 computer to have it done right. Computer and wire harness, and then at that point they just wasted $1,000.
Yeah, and there's a couple different computer setups that are out on the market. I know there was one that was a Stinger, and I think that's what I had on my car at the time.
Yeah, that was the computer I used for the last 20 years. It was fantastic, but the processor is not made anymore, so they stopped making that computer about a year ago.
So if you've got it and it runs good, it's great. If you got it and it's not running good, you're just going to need to upgrade your setup.
Yeah.
And so what EFI system do you suggest that people use now?
I use a Link computer, the later model Link. They call it a Link X, or they call it a Link Atom X. And that's the latest and greatest. Great ECU. Basically the same price as the Stinger. We haven't changed the price any. And so it's just a better ECU now.
And then in respect to some of the other parts and pieces, I mean, the big caveat I think that people have to get over when they're converting an air-cooled to water-cooled in a sedan or a car, because in an off-road vehicle, it's easy just to put a radiator, bolt it out back over, to the roll bar and run it like that. But when you're doing one of these conversions, an air-cooled to water-cooled car, some of the biggest issues, because I'm sure people have brought you some real rattle traps to work on, and I think some of the biggest issues they have is people don't understand how a radiator quite works with airflow.
Yeah, that's a big problem. I had a guy that just came in the other day, and he had a big radiator in the front of his car in a Bug. He had no louvers, no anything. He made a little scoop down below the valance, and he expected the air to go up there. And then he had these two little 8-inch fans on a radiator. They almost looked big, small enough to be computer fans. I mean, it was like kind of ridiculous. And he goes, well, the air is going to ram up here. It's going to go through here, and it's only going to go through the radiator. And I'm all, no, this isn't going to work. I don't even know if it's going to work for the dyno. And once the car got hot on the dyno, it never cooled down. We had to actually shut the car off to let the water cool down, because it would not cool down with both his fans working. And so this is really a common problem.
Yeah, and one of the things with these cars is I had a sand car that had an NA motor, and the NA motor had an aftermarket turbo setup on it. And the guy I ended up trading that car to, I told him, I said, I only run race gas because I made one mistake one time of not running race gas, because an NA motor, what's the compression setup on one of those NA motors typically?
They're all 10-to-1.
So 10-to-1, and you add turbo on top of that, you're pushing 14, 15 to 1 compression under boost.
Yeah. Well, yeah, 15-to-1 compression would theoretically be 7.5 pounds of boost, as it's just not tolerable on 91 octane gas. So there's just no way to do that. People always think, oh yeah, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to run low boost. Well, what's low boost? They think 7 or 8 pounds is low boost, and that's enough to blow them. I mean, the motor can barely run on 91 octane with no turbo, let alone 1 or 2 or 3 pounds of boost. So, if I'm building the motor and I'm doing a turnkey engine, I can set the compression and make it be 8.3-to-1, which is what we do for turbo on pump gas. But again, to do a turbo application in a Bug, you just have to have a lot of patience and time, and it might be so overwhelming that the project never gets done. That's why I'm a big promoter for the 200 horsepower, make it work. And if that's not enough, then you work from there.
And I have to ask you this question. I'm sure you've seen the video that's been all over YouTube recently with the blue Super Beetle that's got a 500 horsepower Subi setup in it. Have you happened to see that video yet?
I think I did see that, where a guy took a lady for a ride or something like that.
Yeah, and he's got just an immense amount of power in that Beetle. But that guy's done. I mean, it looks like that guy's a professional fabricator, and did quite a bit of work, just to shoehorn that thing in there. Plus, 2/3 of his back seat section's gone because half the boost pipes and all that stuff are up in that area.
Right, and that I just saw that one time. But the average, if you will, VW enthusiast doesn't have those capabilities and doesn't have the time or to make that happen.
Yeah, one of the things that a lot of people think about, at least what I've been thinking about when in the process of converting my car, which I haven't started yet. I've got the grill mouth cut under the front bumper. I've been talking with some people about doing, the radiator placement and the air intake and the air exhaust that goes through the radiator, and actually sealing that off so it's in its own compartment. The air comes up underneath and then out through the frame head of the car, so it doesn't kind of baffle inside the hood. But one of the things that I've been thinking about is, in theory, you should be able to run, if you wanted to put this in your square back or whatever, you should be able to run the AC and, an AC compressor and all that kind of stuff. And that really wouldn't tax those motors too much, would it?
So the first problem is if you turn the intake manifold around and you reverse the alternator, like, we commonly do, then the alternator is now in the AC compressor location. So if you're planning on doing AC, you have to have the intake manifold left in the stock location and the alternator left in the stock location. And that means for sure you're going to be modifying or relocating the throttle body, but having the intake with standard orientation. Did that make sense?
Yeah. Now, how far would you need to, let's say you wanted to do that? Could you actually how far can you move that throttle body away from the intake mouth? I mean, could you move it?
You could move it 18 inches if you wanted. I mean, it's not going to be any major dramatic issue.
And you could put a hard 90 bend at the mouth of the intake manifold.
Yes. So the problem is with AC, the compressor is not going to tax the motor as far as that goes, but the condenser is going to be the issue. Where do you put the condenser, which is normally like a little mini radiator in front of the radiator in a car, because there's no room for a radiator up there. I mean, it's already bad enough. So to put a condenser up there, you're really looking for, and then that just means you're heating up the air before it gets to the radiator, which is already going to be it's not going to be sufficient enough in the first place. I haven't seen someone do an effective one that works really well, but I could see there's some potential there.
Now, do you work with, so you don't do any of the conversions because you obviously don't have a facility because really every car, unless you spent 6 months making custom parts to convert a type 1, a type 2, a type 3, I mean, it's all custom work, and you don't really do much of that because you don't really have the manpower or the desire to go to that length of the conversions, right?
Yeah. So I have the manpower. I have 12 employees, but we're so busy doing things that we're proficient at. So the problem is that I can't be efficient at putting a radiator in a VW bug. There's just too many possibilities. Like you mentioned, that there's some of the customers might be on the cheaper side. And I mean, I've seen some guys go to other shops and they charge them $1,500 to put a radiator in the front, and it's a horrible job and it's not efficient. It doesn't even work. And so I suppose I could come up with a VW bug radiator package or something. But, one of them I did, I took the gas tank out and we put a 10 by 30, VW, like a round tank, one of those buggy tanks in there. And that way we had tons of air. We had all the air, so the radiator. So one of the problems is not just getting air up to the radiator, but you have to have air leave the radiator. And there's so little room where that spare tire goes that you're really pushing the air with a fan right up against the gas tank or the bulkhead up there. And so there's no way for the air to leave. And so when we did that one where we put a 10 by 30 gas tank up there, it really opened up a lot of area for the radiator to discharge the hot air.
Right, because those are a lot of the parts that people don't think of when they're doing these conversions, is like getting the hot air, like cooling off the radiator. Where's the hot air go?
Yes.
Now,
they just think, well, I put a radiator in there, I put a fan on, and everything's going to be okay. The bottom line is you have to have natural airflow. You do not want your fan to ever have to come on while you're driving down the road. If it does, then your cooling system is insufficient. Yeah. Ideally, you have vents and ducting and whatnot so that at 30 or 40 mile an hour sustained speed that you have enough airflow that the fan would never come on. So I got some guys that bury a radiator in the back seat area Well, there's zero airflow there, so the fans have to run all the time, and they don't even, so even if you're going 50, 60 miles down the road, the fans have to be on. That's a poor planning of a cooling system.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that goes into that aspect of the conversion. I think the key aspect is once you figured out the how to cool the water cooling system. Once you get that eliminated, it's build that reliable power plant and then put those things in there. I mean, what kind of mileage do people get out of these typical Subaru motors? I mean, what's the most mileage you've seen on one of these EJ motors?
Well, believe it or not, we do lots of Porsche replica motors, and I've had some guys, those are very light. Those are lighter than a VW Bug. I mean, they're a really small fiberglass on a Bug pan. And I have had some reports of over 30 miles to the gallon. So I don't get tons of report about the normal mileage, but I would say in the mid to high 20s would be a range for a VW Bug kind of thing.
And then like lifespan of these motors when you're putting them in these conversions on these lighter cars like this. I mean, what's the most mileage you've seen accrued on a stock motor as far as miles, thousands of miles?
I don't have any data on that, but because they're usually in a more of a, it's not in a daily driver, it's more of a weekend warrior kind of a car.
Sure.
Porsche replica, maybe fair weather because it's a convertible and those kind of things. So they're not seeing the type of mileage on there, but there's no reason why that motor can't go 100,000 miles, right? I mean, it would go 3 times longer than any VW Bug motor would go, that's for sure.
And on these motors, do you start when you're building somebody a motor? You start. I mean, there's no shortage of rebuildable cores out there, and you start with rebuildable cores, or do you start with all new stuff?
Yeah, it's a rebuildable cores. Basically, we start with cores that are a blown up motor because we rebuild every one of them. We buy cores pretty cheap because we're buying them in any condition. They could have a rod knock, they could have a broken timing belt, bent valves, they could have anything because we're just buying it as a core. We are going to do a valve job. We're going to be doing bore. We're going to put a crankshaft bearings in there. So it really doesn't matter for us. And our shop, we're pretty big. We do our own in-house boring, rod resizing, a lot of the procedures we do in our in-house.
And on the factory internals on these motors, I mean, is it a counterweight crank and heavy duty rods and that from the factory? I mean, comparatively to a VW, or do you typically upgrade all that stuff, or is that more saved for boost motors?
So the cranks are fantastic. A stock crank could handle 800 horsepower. I mean, they're just really, really a strong unit. So there's no problem with the bottom end. In non-turbo form, they're really a strong unit. Once you go turbo, obviously you want to beef up the rods and put better pistons in. But in a non-turbo application, the bottom end is just stout, really stout.
And do they typically lighten flywheels in these things, or they run with is the factory flywheel pretty light compared to VW?
The adapter kit that Kennedy sells, it's probably very similar to what a VW is. Maybe it's a little bit heavier. Nobody really lightens the flywheel. Lightening the flywheel would be like a drag race type of a thing, because in street application and you're pushing along a heavier car, if you have too light of a flywheel, you let the clutch out too fast and it can slow down too fast because it's light, doesn't have any mass behind it. And so you could stall your motor. So believe it or not, in the Vanagon application, we make a custom flywheel that's heavier than normal because you want to have the momentum going so that when you take off in a 4,000-pound Vanagon, that it doesn't just stall on you every time. So there's zero reason to be wanting to have a lightened flywheel street application, short of you being a drag racer.
Now, speaking of Vanagons, is that, let's say for VWs that lend themselves to conversions, is that the easiest? Is that the most straightforward conversion? Is like a water cooled Vanagon?
Yeah, there's a couple of companies out there that are specific on Vanagons. I mean, actually, there's probably 5 or 6 companies out there, and they really specialize in the Vanagon. It's great because it is water cooled, so they're really kind of dealing mostly with the stuff in the back, not having to install a radiator, having to install water lines. So yeah, it makes it pretty convenient to do that conversion.
Yeah, I mean it's a fascinating, wide open realm of the things that you can do with these Subi conversions, and I just think the only thing really holding these back, honestly, from really taking over the VW aftermarket is really somebody that could put together a turnkey conversion package. In other words, they go to you, buy a turnkey motor, and then someone else will be able to supply them with the sheet metal, the pieces and parts that are easily that make the conversion that much easier, because I think that's the challenge where a lot of people end up getting lost, is just trying to do, they don't realize how much more there is to a water cooled motor in respect to doing that conversion. Now,
Right.
do they make do you use on your applications, you guys use stock water pumps and all that stuff?
Oh yeah. A
So
water pump is not a positive displacement pump. It just circulates the water. So as long as the cooling system is full, the radiator could be, 3 feet higher than the engine. That's not a problem because the water, whatever is pushing up is also coming down. And it's just rotating, it's just circulating the water. It's not really lifting the water. So the problem comes in a cooling system that was like that with a radiator high. If you were somehow low on water, like if you were 2 quarts low, the water pump is not going to push the water uphill and over this, air brake that's at the top of the radiator. So
sure.
water pump can push forward. It could go to the front of the car. It just circulates the water.
And then going back to the core motors that you pick up, what do you see as the most common, like what's the most common reason for people to be blowing up these motors?
Well, boy, that's an open question. The turbo motors is clearly because they add extra boost, or they put in cheap gas and they're cracking ring lands. That's like a really common scenario, but we're not dealing with turbo motors, so we're really dealing with non-turbo motors.
Right.
And of course, if you're following my example of doing a non-turbo single red cam motor, as far as what they come in for, boy, shabby workmanship. Someone does a tiny belt and they, break something and bend the valves. That might be one thing. Lose a crank bearing. Those would be the typical things of why we would be seeing that motor as a core motor.
And on these motors, do you run synthetic oil in these motors, or do you run just conventional oil?
Well, I tell all my customers there's good, better, and best. So the best would be we run Mobile One is what we recommend if they want to spend the best amount of money, best oil. If they don't want to do that, the next best would be like VR1 Racing Oil. I love that oil. VR stands for Valvoline Racing, so it's easy to remember, VR1 Racing Oil. And then after that, then the good oil would just be any normal dinosaur oil, Castrol, Valvoline, a multi-grade 1040, that type of thing.
So 1040 is like the recommended viscosity that you use for these type of motors in your average application with decent weather.
Yeah, average application, fair weather. These are, if we rebuild them, if it was a brand new stock motor, maybe it could even be thinner oil, some 1030, maybe some 520, that kind of thing. But that would be like if we started with a brand new short block. Bearing clearances are really tight, so you get away with a little bit thinner oil. But if we rebuild them, 1030, 1040 is totally the type of oil we would be using. And sometimes in dune buggy application, we pretty much recommend 1550, 2050.
Okay, so that's just because the motor's going to run a little hotter, a little more on the top end, going through the
Well,
dunes.
you're going to be working it harder, and the bearing clearances are opened up a lot more. I mean, they're pretty generous because guys are winging these things at 4, 5, 6,000 RPM all the time. So bearing clearance has to be looser. So the oil, it's protecting that looser clearance.
Oh, really? So on an off-road motor application, you'll have a little more tolerance in the bearing than you will with a factory setup.
Oh yeah, yeah. Stock setup. So if you're into engine building, a standard, the rule of thumb for aftermarket building is 1 thou per inch of rod journal. So if a rod journal was 2 inches in diameter, the typical rod bearing clearance would be 2 thou. But in a factory motor, rod bearing clearance will hover in the 7/10 to 1 thou for that same journal. So that's really, really tight.
Wow.
what they're able to do with a really tight bearing clearance is run thinner oil. Thinner oil promotes better gas mileage, and factories are looking for, maximum gas mileage. That's really, that is really important to them. So thinner oils help in, having a motor run freer, but to have sustained high RPM operation with a rod journal that has 7/10 bearing clearance, that is just like, looking for some issues there.
Yeah. No, I'm surprised at how tight those factory tolerances are. And then with you seeing so many rebuilt motors and these things having 5 rod journals, usually the bottom ends, like you said earlier, are pretty solid. So if let's say a guy's out there kind of a DIY guy, and he's going to use you as a resource to get parts and stuff like that, but he's just really a hands-on guy and wants to do it. The bottom ends, if he checks, there's some ways that he can check the tolerance on the bottom end without blowing it apart, that you can tell if it's, can you look, what's a telltale sign when you look at a short block and see if it needs to be gone through?
Well, every short block does get gone through. There's no looking at something and saying, yeah, I can run this thing as a good short block. Sure. And the other thing is, in order for you to see the main journal bearings, the actual block comes apart. So you're all the way down to the bare, you're to the very last part when you're checking rod and main bearings. It's not like a inline 4-cylinder where you could drop main bearing, caps and take a look at your main bearings, or even sneak them out of there, like a Honda or just any kind of inline 4. Yeah. That's easy. On a Subaru, it's a lot more labor intensive because you're splitting the cases to get down to the main bearings.
And how many of these motors, when you rebuild them, how many of them stay like a standard bore? Do you line bore many of the cases, or it's not needed?
So because they're aluminum cases, line boring is very rare. VWs, you could do 1, 2, 3 steps over. Who knows how many steps you can go over, and they sell bearings like that. But in the Subaru world, there's only really one oversized bearing. It's a 10 thou oversized for the case. So, and the only time we're really line boring the case is if there was a problem, like they spun a main bearing. That's very rare. Or if we're building a really high performance motor and we're using ARP case bolts, stock case bolts get torqued to effectively in the 35 feet-pound of torque range. Mm-hmm. And so when you do aftermarket case bolts, you could be torquing the block up to 50 or 60 pounds. And if that's the case, then you're distorting the main bearing journal size. It's becoming an egg shape. So if you ever use aftermarket case bolts, you have to line bore. And so then it triggers having an oversized bearing.
Yeah, and then I saw that you do something in regards to you seal the decks on the blocks, like you do like you fill in the void around the cylinder.
Yeah, we call it a closed deck block. It's basically a girdle that gets put inside the block. That's what we're famous for. That was probably the most famous thing that we do is our closed deck block. We have people over 1,000 horsepower with 4-cylinder motors with our closed deck blocks running. But that is not something that someone doing a non-turbo motor would ever do. That would be a waste of money. Simply, a non-turbo just doesn't have really big cylinder pressure. No reason to support the cylinders with the girdle. So you would just run a regular block.
And so your advice is typically, if a guy's going to do a VW conversion and you want it to be as pain-free as possible, you're saying a single cam motor is just fine for a VW conversion. The typical EJ, the biggest single cam motor that they make is that the like a EJ 18 or do they? No,
EJ 25. So basically EJ and then 18 means 1.8 liter, right, and EJ 25 is 2.5 liter. So the two single overhead cam common motors is the 2.2 and the 2.5. Those two are both, they make them in the single overhead cam non-turbo application. Mm-hmm. So again, to recap that, if you have emission requirements, you have to use a stock ECU, and the typical motor package is a 2.2. To me, I'm hoping that you could, that your application will be for off-road, or that you have a car that doesn't need you're in a state where the emissions don't matter, then you could run a 2.5 single overhead cam, and that's just the biggest bang for the buck.
Yeah. Well, John, I tell you, we've covered a lot of stuff tonight, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you think is something maybe important that when people are considering doing a conversion or going through the stuff, like anything that we didn't cover that you think might need to be discussed?
No, I think we probably covered most of it. I'd be glad to come back for round two if you have some feedback from your clientele that watches this video. Be glad to answer any of those questions.
No, absolutely, man. And I definitely appreciate you. I know you're a busy guy, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast. And I'll definitely have you back for a round two, because I think there's a lot more I'm going to start digging into this as I start really getting ready to do this conversion. I gotta get a plan put together and figure out what I'm doing and trying to get the most reliable. I want to be able to take my 67 Squareback and be able to hop on the freeway and take off on a 300, 400 mile trip and not have to worry about a thing. So hopefully that's a reality for me in the near future. So
yeah, sounds great. And I have some pictures that I can forward you at the shop on some of the applications. Maybe one of them was in a bug where there's an intake manifold was reversed and throttle body was remote mounted. So you can kind of take some looks at those.
No, I definitely appreciate it, and we'll for sure have you on again. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
All right, thanks, Bill.